With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
To Heard Tell, our buddy Eric Garcia wrote a book on autism so good it is Mrs. Donaldson approved. That'd be my mother, longtime special education teacher. I actually want to start right there and talking a little bit about autism, though, because you were tweeting about it, and the reason I bring this up is because people are getting more open about talking about it for good, bad, and indifferent, but we'll talk about that in just a second. We're starting to get politicians being open about this. We're getting sports figures that are open about this. We're getting stars to be more open about this. We just talked mental health with our friend, Dr. Katie Gordon, and she talked about this as like, yeah, people kind of blow it off, but this is important stuff when people just start openly talking about it. Now that we're getting them into the political realm, and we can talk about New York 10 and things like this, how do we need to approach it as a society and as people that comment on it? Because one of the things we bash about is the portrayals in media and in movies. Politicians are portraying it too, and I don't mean that in a performative manner. I just mean they're avatars and standard bearers for this stuff.
Yes.
How should we be approaching and covering them? Should we treat it any different? Should we treat it different? Because as you're a journalist, first and foremost, you know, there's not a style book guide to this stuff. We're writing it as we go. So how do we deal with it?
There is, you're right. There are some style book guides, so like the ASU's National Center on Disability Journalism has a pretty good style book. But even then, there's still some things like, you know, how do we? The perfect example that I often use is, do you use person with autism or autistic person? Person first versus identity first language. And the answer is, you know, you ask. You ask people what they say, what they prefer. That's very important. But I think also it's one of those things where, you know, the AP style book had a real row because there was a big question of how do you know, they said, you know, use person first language. Well, that works for people with Down syndrome and that works for people with cerebral palsy and people with intellectual disabilities. But other people, you know, other people with groups of disability, like autistic people, blind people, deaf people, some of them prefer, you know, identity first language. So I think it's real. I think as you said, this is really difficult. And I think I think it's difficult to shoehorn it into the older prescribed ideas of about how to write these things. And I think a lot of it depends on what people themselves say. One of the things that I was really adamant about when I was writing my book was asking, how do you want to be referred? Do you want to be referred to as a person with autism? Do you want to be referred to as an autistic person? And that's gonna be something that I think journalists are gonna have to adapt to, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. In the same way, I think, so you know, in New York 10, for example, so today there's going to be a primary with Yuli New, who's running to. If she wins her primary, she'd be likely the first openly autistic member of Congress. And one of the things that I think that's interesting is that she said, you know, for the longest time we've talked about, you know, I think a lot of news outlets say, oh, people don't let their disability define them. Whereas she said, you know, it's very much shaped how she is. So that's a question about how do we use that language and how do we say, like, you know, if people's disability defines them, we should say, like, I think that leads to the question without being rude. And that's a whole other thing. It's like, how does being a person with a disability shape you? How does it inform you? How does it inform you as a policymaker? You know, it's about, you know, and obviously this is all dependent on how comfortable they are talking about it. So these are going to be some real questions that I don't have a real clear answer to, but I'm still learning and I'm trying to figure it out as well.
But that's the problem, isn't it? Because every case of autism or every case of Down syndrome or every case of whatever, pick your developmental disability sort of thing, or whatever somebody's struggling with, they're all different and they affect everybody a little bit differently. This isn't like some other things where you can just take a broad brush. So do we need the Good Congressman TV series to go with the Good Lawyer and the Good Doctor? That's the question now, because you know, let's be honest, our politicians are TV characters now.
Yes, they are.
They are. So I'm being a little facetious there, but that's probably what somebody's going to come up with next. Is like, oh, well, we need to have the good president or the good. And I'm not knocking it because I actually like the Good Doctor. I think it's a good show.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure that that's going to be a scalable thing where we need to do it 4, 5, 6 times. You were tweeting about this. I'll ask you because you're in that community. I'm not. How does it land with you with portrayals like that? Because I understand it's artistic, so it's subjective.
Yeah.
Is it in the line of, oh, they're covering this good or they're exploiting it? That's a fine line. Where does it fall?
It is a very fine line. I think the thing that I've always said is that, so as far as I can tell, when I was writing the book, I tried to see if they had any autistic advisors. They do have some people with disabilities as advisors, but not specifically autistic. I've seen, so, I've watched a few episodes of it. I haven't, like, it's not the, it gets some things right. It gets some things wrong, I think. But I think more than anything, what I would like to see is more than just doing spin-offs of these shows. I think what I'd like to see is more stuff, more material created by autistic creators or autistic screenwriters. I do know of some people in Los Angeles who do work in the industry, and they really try hard to get their material in front of an executive or in front of Netflix or HBO Max or whatever, and then forget the fact that a lot of these streaming services are cutting right now. That's a whole other issue. But I think that one of the things that's difficult is creating an incentive for the entertainment industry to pick these things up and pick them up when they're created by people with disabilities. Or when they're even in front of the camera. I think, we saw this a little bit with Coda when it won the Academy Award for Best Picture. That was good, and from what I understand, I know people in the deaf community have mixed opinions about it, but they were happy that it got the funding, it got the promotion from Apple, it got the promotion, it had a whole PR campaign. What it's going to need, what this will need, what I think, it's not just about picking up these shows, it's about, will networks or will, production companies, will they put the full force of their, PR and promotion machine into promoting this and saying that this is content worth watching?
What do you do with a reality show like Love on the Spectrum? Because I know the household had it on the other day, and I was just watching it. I was walking back and forth because I have an open house. If this is just my opinion, I'm not knocking anybody involved. It just feels intrusive to me. Stuff like that. Because it's interpersonal relationships. I get it. It's like, oh, they can have love. Like, look, I'm all for it. Again, my mom was a special ed teacher. I grew up surrounded by kids with what we now call autism. They didn't know that back in the 80s so much. Kids with Down syndrome. And you got to understand how special education worked back then. My mom would have these kids in high school level for 7, 8, 9 years usually. So you really developed a relationship with these, the Shane Cogers of the world, who I can still hear his voice to this day, who's still alive, by the way, doing well. It feels invasive to me because I grew up around those kinds of folks, and I knew them, and they were my friends, and I love them and I care about them. That kind of stuff feels intrusive to me. I understand you want to portray them as just, hey, they're doing these normal things. It feels
like very Discovery Channel-ish.
Yeah, that one bothers me. How does it hit you?
Yeah,
so and I'm not singling it out. I'm just saying. I
don't want to single it out. I don't want to, So I watched the Australian version. I still need to watch the American version.
That's what they had on last night. The Aussie.
So the Aussie one, from what I understand, the American one is better. From what people I know and autistic people who I know who've watched it say, that one, the American version, is better. The Aussie one felt really. I watched like 5 episodes of it, and it came out toward the end of me writing my book. And it felt really, I got the same feeling you did. It felt real. I got really clammy watching it. It felt really like, some of the couples and some of the people on that show are great. I don't want to knock them, good for them. And I was really happy for them. Others, it just felt really like, I felt like, as you said, I felt like I was invading their privacy almost. And I was almost like, because it's one thing to give your consent, because, obviously all these people had to give their consent. But I don't know how I feel about, like, you can't once you sign that waiver, the production companies get licensed to do whatever to clip and choose whatever they want. And so just giving a license of consent doesn't necessarily mean that it's all honky-dory. And there were parts of it that I really just felt like, should I be watching this? Is it appropriate? And not like it's explicit or anything like that, but it's just like, it felt like there was some stuff that I wouldn't like about my life being broadcast. I don't know if I feel comfortable with that. That's just me.
That's my argument against reality TV in general, by the way. So it's not me being inconsistent just because it's folks with on the autism spectrum. It's like, look, my rule on Twitter about reality TV. Those folks signed a contract, so they signed up for it. But that's part of what bothers me here is when you start getting into these communities, and I don't want to denigrate anybody. I really don't. So
no, I get what you're saying.
Like, I'm not sure we should really be pushing that kind of contracts on folks in that community in the first place, just as a general rule, but that's just me.
That is, so I'll say this. When I was writing my book, I went to Marshall University in West Virginia, and there were college students. And one of the things that I did is I said, I'm going to have you sign a waiver, say you're okay with this. But the thing that I felt was that I felt that what I did is I was very upfront with them. I said, I'm autistic. And I want to make sure that I get this right. So if I have any questions, I'll reach out to you, because I didn't want to do that. And there was another time, there was another person who I interviewed, not at Marshall, but somewhere else. Really important story that I really wanted to include in the book. But there was just something about the stuff that he told me about his personal life. And I just felt really, really like I made this phone call literally like days before I turned in the manuscript. And I said, I want to make sure you're okay with this because you have to live with this. I don't. And then he said, no, could you please take it out? And it sucked because I thought that his stuff was really important. But at the end of the day, he has to live with it. I don't. And I think that the difference is who's behind the camera. If you have people who've been through similar experiences, or if you have autistic people who are advising or producing or things like that, that might lead to more sensitivity and recognition about like what's appropriate and what's not appropriate to show. And I think that is where I feel kind of uncomfortable, is that because if you don't have that cultural knowledge, then you might not know what's appropriate to include and what's not appropriate to. That's just me. It's one guy's opinion. I'm not saying, I'm not saying that my word is gospel.
No, I think it's a tough subject. One more thing on this autism stuff, because I thought we were done with this, but apparently not. They're going to keep going through it. For folks that don't know, because I'm old enough to remember when we did this in the early 2000s, the late 90s, especially in the early 2000s, right when the internet came along, of course, that's when this mess started. We've got to untangle autism from this vaccine mess.
Yes.
We've just got to, because we're gonna get people killed with this nonsense. I usually try to be nonsense, but I've just had it with this.
I've lost my patience now that we're seeing polio in New York.
One of the greatest achievements in human history, literally one of the greatest achievements in human history, was defeating polio. Coming up with the vaccine, and it was a mess. They accidentally put the live virus in. Eisenhower had to go on TV, one of the first TV addresses, and be like, no, the vaccine's safe. People don't understand what an achievement it was. We defeated polio. It was gone. And now it's back out of our own ignorance, and we're using autism as an excuse to do it. I have no patience for this. You speak on it.
How do you think I feel? I am just so livid because this is the real. Okay, now you got me on my soapbox. This is the reason why it gets me so upset. Is because it treats autism as a problem, and it treats autistic people as a problem to be fixed. And then what it does is it puts the blame on parents. Because what it says is it's your fault your child is autistic because you got your kid the shots. They then place the blame on the doctors. And we spend all this time blaming everybody for the kid being autistic when that does nothing to help autistic people in school. That does nothing, We're not spending. We still do not have enough funding for home care. There was this great series of articles. I'm sure you saw me tweeting about it in the Houston Chronicle about the wait lists in Texas for autistic kids waiting to get their services through Medicaid. It does nothing to ameliorate the fact that people on SSI have to live in poverty. It does. By focusing on this, we're getting people killed because we're not focusing on polio, and we are not actually focusing on autistic people's lives. And then we are. This is just again. Now you got me all hopped up. It makes me mad because I think about this one kid I interviewed. Now they're an adult, so I don't want to call them a kid, but they're their name's Aaron Starr, and their mom believed the horse hockey about vaccines and autism, and their mom blamed themselves for it. And instead of spending time focusing on how to help their kid live a fulfilling life, helping them make sure that they graduate from college and live a good life, all that, they spent all this time blaming themselves. It is just the most infuriating thing, and it makes lasers shoot out of my eyes. So anyway, rant over.
No, but that's why I think people need to hear the rant. Because what happens is parents are susceptible. Parenting advice is a multi-billion-dollar industry in America.
It is.
You've worked in media for a while now. They openly talk like, what are we going to do with the mom demographic? That's a thing in media. It's absolutely a thing. And to use it exploitively towards a group of people who have something that they didn't ask for, it's something that nature put in them.
Yes.
And to treat it like it's this disease to cure instead of something that we should be helping these people live with and become their best. I started thinking about you hit on one of my pet peeves right there. You talked about, the SSI payments. On one hand, we take away things like the sheltered workshop and giving them job skills. And on the other hand, we tell them like, oh, you can't work because you won't have your benefits anymore if you make money. This kind of double speak stuff, it all starts going together. It's like, oh, well, this vaccine causes autism. Well, autism is this, that, and the other. Oh, you can't work. We'll put you on government benefits, but we're not going to give you enough benefit. There's a lot of just double speak when it comes to autism and disabilities in general in America.
Yes.
And we've got to find some way to cut through the double speak. And some of it's because government bureaucracy that's built into the system. I get that.
Yeah, exactly.
But at some point, and that's why I loved your book so much, you just go talk to the people. You skip all the double speak.
Yeah.
And that's really the core of and I will pitch your book because it's that good, not just because you're a friend. That's the double speak that really hurts people that are trying to live with disabilities. Instead of giving them a hand up, you're giving them a hand up while you're holding them on the top of the head at the same time. And that's just infuriating.
That is, it is. The thing that I say a lot of times is that I cannot imagine, so like I grew up in the 1990s when there wasn't in some ways it was the best of times and there was the worst of times, because like it was great. It was bad because there was, I feel for my mom in a lot of ways because there just wasn't a lot of information at the time. But on the other hand, I'm also kind of grateful that we didn't have the internet, because that means that my mom wasn't subjected to a lot of quackery. I don't think I'm speaking out of turn when I say that. And as a result, I think I don't envy any parent as soon as they get the autism diagnosis for their kid. I don't, because immediately they are subjected to a deluge of misinformation and the right information wrong. And it's hard. I don't blame them for like not knowing what the right stuff to do is. I mean, I think I don't know if you saw that Stat News piece about like how a lot of private equity companies are getting involved in ABA. And like, that's another thing, because now you have people are making money off something, and there's an incentive to pressure parents into doing that. So there is so much misinformation, and it is endlessly frustrating because it doesn't actually address what they need. Just last month I was at a conference with a bunch of non-speaking autistic people, and their stories were all the same, which was for the longest time they went through a bunch of different treatments, a lot of different, quote unquote cures, or a lot of different therapies, and it wasn't until they got to speech communication or keypads or what have you that they decide that their lives overnight got better. And but it shouldn't take going through all those hoops to finally have the Paul going through the desert in Damascus moment, you know?
Yeah, and it's amazing that the technology is running so far ahead of the policy. We talked about this when we did the long form podcast.
Yes, we
One of
did.
the most listened ones we've ever had, by the way. Well done on that.
Thank you.
But that's because people want good information. They really do want the good information on this
They
stuff if
do.
you get it out there. But this is the thing: is the technology has run so far ahead, and especially autism stuff, both policy wise and educational. We talked about it before. It really was organic and parent driven because they just didn't have anywhere else to go.
Yes.
Our our country deserves the government it gets, but these folks deserve a much better government than they're getting. And I'll just kind of leave it at that to end the rant on it. Eric Garcia, this is fantastic stuff. I could talk to you all day. That's why we have you back more and more. You do great work, my friend. Let folks know where they can follow you. Pitch the book. We're going to link to it. I'm going to send some stuff out on the book. Oh, We Are Not Broken. He's going to hold it up because he knows how to do a segment because he's a media professional. Look at that.
Yeah.
There you go. If you're watching on the YouTube. Go ahead, sir.
We're Not Broken, Change the Autism Conversation. It is now officially out on paperback. It has a new afterword about vaccines, stuff we were talking about the panic about it, how the autism vaccine panic gave rise to the coronavirus vaccine panic, and so much more. It is now available wherever you can get fine books. And I always love coming back here because you actually know what you're talking about. You actually take the time to do the work. So I always love coming on here.
I appreciate that. You steer me some other folks too, which I really appreciate. Love talking to you, my friend. The book is important. Maybe the sequel on vaccines might want to kick that idea around. That'll sell to somebody. My friend, I appreciate you as a friend. I really appreciate the work you do. We'll do this again real soon, my friend. Eric Garcia, you're great, my friend.
Thank you, my friend.
Thank you, sir. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.